The billionaire laughed in the courtroom because he thought he had already won. His lawyers smirked, the reporters scribbled as if the verdict had already been written, and his smug smile spread wider with every passing second. But the laughter was built on arrogance, on the belief that money could crush truth, and that the powerless had no voice. What no one knew was that the maid he had ignored for years, the woman they thought invisible, carried within her a secret that would shatter his empire. When her turn came, when she stood before them trembling yet unbroken, and opened her mouth in fluent Arabic, the silence that followed was louder than thunder. Her name was Amara, though hardly anyone ever used it. To most, she was just the maid. She rose before the sun, her body aching from years of hard labor, and spent her life cleaning rooms so pristine they looked untouched. She polished floors that reflected golden chandeliers she could never afford, carried silver trays filled with champagne she could never taste, and watched parties where the wealthy laughed, never once noticing the tired woman in the corner making their world spotless. She was there but unseen, a shadow in a mansion overflowing with glitter, yet behind the silence of her days lived memories her employers never imagined. She was the daughter of a schoolteacher who once filled her childhood with books and languages. Her father would sit by the candlelight, teaching her to pronounce Arabic words with care, telling her, "Knowledge is a light, Amara. Even when the world tries to keep you in darkness, no one can steal what you carry in your mind." But poverty struck after his death. Dreams of university evaporated. She was forced into domestic work, trading her books for brooms. Her brilliance went unnoticed, buried beneath layers of dust and duty. Victor Hale, the billionaire who employed her, saw her as nothing more than a background figure. He was a man who believed power meant invincibility. His empire stretched across continents, built on steel, oil, and whispered corruption. His arrogance was legendary. Staff whispered of his cruelty, of his habit of breaking people with money or threats. He had silenced journalists, intimidated rivals, and destroyed anyone who dared stand against him. In his mind, the courtroom was nothing more than a stage on which he would once again emerge victorious, but power makes men careless. Hale trusted no one except his wealth, and in that arrogance, he allowed secrets to slip. He believed none of his servants could understand the languages in which he conducted his most dangerous dealings. Amara, polishing floors outside his study, often overheard conversations he held in Arabic with foreign partners. At first, she thought nothing of it, until she glimpsed documents, thick stacks of paper filled with signatures and numbers that did not match the life of a clean businessman. When she quietly whispered the words on the page, she realized what they were: proof of corruption, fraud, and exploitation on a scale so vast it could bring him down. Her heart pounded each time she passed that study. Fear gnawed at her. If anyone discovered what she knew, what she had overheard, she could be ruined. She had no money, no safety net. She was a maid, one dismissal away from hunger. Yet silence weighed heavier than fear. She thought of the workers abroad whose lives were being crushed by his greed, of the arrogance with which he dismissed anyone beneath him. She thought of her father's words, reminding her that knowledge was light. And so she decided, if called, she would speak. The trial began under the world's gaze. Journalists from every major outlet crowded the courtroom, certain that the billionaire would escape once more. He had the finest lawyers, the best connections, and the endless confidence of a man who believed the rules bent around him. The evidence seemed weak, the witnesses intimidated. Hale smiled like a king awaiting his coronation. And then Amara's name was called. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A maid? What could she possibly contribute? Lawyers exchanged amused glances, and Hale chuckled under his breath. In his mind, this was nothing more than a nuisance, a meaningless interruption before his inevitable acquittal. Amara walked slowly to the witness stand. Her steps were careful, her hands trembling slightly, but in her eyes flickered the courage of someone carrying truth too heavy to bury. At first, the question seemed ordinary. Did you work for Mr. Hale? Yes. Did you have access to his private documents? She hesitated. Murmurs filled the room. Hale leaned back in his chair, smirk stretching, certain this woman would add nothing. And then, with a steady breath, Amara did the unthinkable. She began to speak in Arabic. Perfect, flawless Arabic that rolled off her tongue with elegance and certainty. The room froze. Reporters lowered their pens, jaws slack. Lawyers blinked in disbelief. The judge leaned forward, straining to catch every word. And Hale's face, once smug and unshakable, drained of color. Amara translated word for word the contents of the documents she had seen. Contracts, agreements, numbers hidden in plain sight. She explained what the conversations meant, what the signatures stood for, how the money flowed illegally. Every phrase was a dagger cutting into Hale's carefully constructed empire. For years, he had hidden behind languages, convinced no one around him could penetrate the wall of words. Yet the woman he ignored daily, the woman who scrubbed his marble floors, now wielded those very words as weapons against him. Silence consumed the courtroom. Not the silence of boredom, but the silence of shock so deep that no one dared breathe. Hale slammed his fist on the table, shouting that she was lying, that she was making it all up. But the judge raised a hand, demanding order. The truth in her words was undeniable, the fluency impossible to fake. The maid had become the most powerful voice in the room, and yet she stopped halfway. She did not reveal everything, only enough to shake the foundation, to rattle the billionaire's confidence, to prove that she carried within her knowledge he could not erase. Reporters scribbled furiously, whispers filled the air, and the weight of expectation pressed down on everyone. What else did she know? What more was hidden in the Arabic she carried like fire on her tongue? The judge adjourned the session, announcing that her testimony would continue the next day. Hale's lawyers scrambled, their confidence slipping into panic. Hale himself sat stiff, his hands trembling though he tried to hide it. He had not imagined this. He had not imagined that the woman he never once saw as human could rise in front of him as his greatest threat. Amara returned home that night to a silence heavier than any she had known. Fear followed her every step, but beneath it burned resolve. She knew tomorrow would decide everything, her job, her safety, perhaps even her life. But she also knew the truth could no longer be silenced. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, steady and warm. No one can steal the light within you, Amara. Speak, and the world will listen. The city buzzed with whispers. Some called her a liar, others a hero. But in the deepest chambers of power, Victor Hale, the billionaire who once laughed at the thought of defeat, sat wide-eyed and sleepless. For the first time in his life, he was afraid, not of another tycoon, not of a rival politician, but of a maid who had dared to open her mouth and speak the language he thought no one understood. Tomorrow, the world would know if her words would end him. Overnight the world erupted. Headlines screamed about the maid who had silenced a billionaire with nothing but her voice. Some papers called her brave, others called her reckless, but every corner of the city carried her name. Strangers on buses whispered about her testimony, markets buzzed with her story, and on social media she was painted as a symbol of hope for the voiceless. For the first time in her life, Amara was not invisible. She was the center of a storm she had never asked for, yet the storm had two sides. Victor Hale's team worked tirelessly to destroy her image. They called her an opportunist, a liar, someone seeking attention. His lawyers pushed stories into the press claiming she had forged her past, that she had no education, that her words were rehearsed. Wealth tried to crush truth once again. But Amara refused to crumble. She had lived in silence long enough, and she knew her voice carried something no money could buy, authenticity. That night, as she rested her tired body on her small bed, she was visited by Hale's lawyer with an offer. He laid out photographs of mansions, spoke of bank accounts overflowing with wealth, promised her a life of freedom from struggle. All she had to do was remain silent. For a moment her heart wavered. Poverty had been her lifelong companion, and here was the chance to erase it forever. But then she remembered the faces of workers she had once seen in photos, men and women exploited abroad by Hale's companies, children living in dust while Hale drank champagne. She remembered her father's words about light and knowledge, about dignity that cannot be bought. She looked the lawyer in the eye and quietly refused. The lawyer left in frustration, but she knew she had just signed a different kind of contract, one written not with ink, but with courage. When she walked into the courtroom the next morning, it was no longer filled with disbelief but with anticipation. Every seat was taken, every camera lens pointed toward her. Reporters whispered that she was the woman who had cracked open the billionaire's fortress. Hale sat opposite her, still dressed in confidence but with eyes that betrayed sleeplessness. He forced a smile, but it trembled at the corners. The questions resumed. Amara straightened her back, drew a deep breath, and continued. She translated document after document, revealing details so precise that no one could doubt her. Contracts showed bribes masked as charity, payments hidden in coded transactions, agreements written to strip workers of their rights. She explained how the conversations in Arabic revealed a carefully woven web of fraud. Each phrase she spoke stripped away another layer of Hale's power. Hale's face darkened with every word. He tried to interrupt, to shout over her, calling her delusional. His voice, once commanding, now sounded desperate. The judge silenced him sharply, reminding him that intimidation had no place here. For the first time in his life, his power did not command the room. Amara's voice did. As she spoke, flashes of her childhood filled her mind. She saw her father bending over a tattered book, guiding her small finger along the lines of Arabic text. She remembered his patience, the pride in his eyes as she learned to pronounce each word. Tears pricked her eyes, but she did not falter. Every word she spoke now was a tribute to him, to the man who had believed in her long before the world had. The courtroom faded for a moment, and all she could hear was his voice telling her that knowledge was her armor. She realized then that she was not just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they were nothing. The weight of the room grew heavier as her testimony unfolded. Lawyers shifted nervously, reporters scribbled as though their pens could not keep up, and the public gallery hung on every syllable. People no longer saw her as just a maid. They saw her as a witness of truth, as a challenger of corruption, as a living reminder that even the smallest voice could shake the tallest tower. By the time she finished, the billionaire's mask had completely shattered. His once proud posture slumped, his hands clenched into fists that could no longer command obedience. The man who had laughed at the world now looked like a man drowning in the truth he could not escape. His empire, once untouchable, had been reduced to whispers of fear and shame. The judges retreated to deliberate. Minutes stretched like hours, tension choking the air. Amara sat quietly, her hands folded, eyes fixed ahead. She did not pray for revenge, only for justice. Hale sat hunched, sweat on his forehead, his arrogance drained. When the judges returned, the courtroom rose. The verdict was read with measured calm, guilty on multiple counts. Guilty of fraud, guilty of corruption, guilty of exploitation. The billionaire who once thought himself above the law was now bound by it. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, others cheered, cameras flashed in a frenzy. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, desperate to capture the moment. Hale buried his face in his hands, his empire collapsing in real time. But Amara sat still, calm in the storm. She had not fought for applause or recognition. She had fought because truth demanded a voice. When she finally stepped outside, the crowd waiting beyond the courthouse broke into cheers. Strangers held signs with her name, children reached out their hands to touch hers, people shouted words of gratitude. For the first time, she was not invisible. For the first time, she walked with her head held high, not as a maid defined by her labor, but as a woman defined by her courage. She did not seek wealth or fame in the days that followed. She returned to her small home, to the quiet corners of her life, but everything had changed. Where once she had been unseen, now she carried the respect of millions. Her story traveled across borders, inspiring others who had been silenced. Workers spoke out, women found courage to stand tall, and the world remembered her not as a servant but as a symbol. The billionaire was gone, stripped of power, remembered only for the arrogance that led to his fall. But Amara remained. She lived her life humbly, but with a dignity no money could ever buy. When asked why she had done it, why she had risked everything to speak, she only smiled softly and said, because silence would have been the greater burden.